the definition of AGI, it's a fuzzy definition, but I think OpenAI's definition is that a large amount of kind of traditional jobs it will be plausible for a computer to do them. And I think now with the right kind of prompting and systems around it, we're actually pretty close to that point. And I don't think enough people, I think a lot of software engineers who play around with this stuff have realized it.
Welcome to Agentic Thinkers, the podcast where we talk to the people actually building agentic AI. Not the hype, not the headlines, real systems in production delivering real outcomes. I'm Matt Elsie. In each episode we sit down with founders, CTOs and enterprise leaders shaping how agents are designed, deployed and governed in the real world. What they're building, what they've learned and where they think it's heading. This podcast is about what it really takes to make agentic AI work at scale, from design and data to guardrails, governance and business impact. Our goal here is simple: to build a community of like-minded agentic thinkers who can share experiences and learn from each other. If you find this useful, subscribe and follow the channel. We're early and your support will help us keep the conversations coming. This episode I've been really excited to welcome Emma Burrows. Emma is founder and CEO of Resonant, a tool to help PMs and UX designers specify coding agent-ready work straight from mocks, whiteboard diagrams and PIDs. Prior to founding Resonant, Emma held leadership roles at Stripe, Charlotte Tilbury and Google. Welcome, Emma, to the Agentic Thinkers.
Thank you.
Tell us about your journey, really, before we get into things. What brought you here? What brought you to the world of AI and to eventually founding Resonant?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll start from where we are and go backwards a little bit. So I've been playing around with agents really since kind of the beginning of the agentic wave, start of 2025 and 2024 before that. So I originally started working on an open source SDK for multi-agent workflows, and then based on a number of kind of pieces of feedback and things that we had learnt, we ended up focusing on kind of how do you use agents across a kind of spectrum of software delivery, particularly focused on product management, UX designers, and how they can better specify the work without necessarily understanding all of the architecture, etc., and get work done faster so that they can keep up with software engineering, essentially. Always wanted to found a company. I was at Stripe for 4 years before I started Resonant, and a company called Charlotte Tilbury, which is e-commerce before that, which people are always like, that's a bit of a weird thing to have done. But it was really an opportunity to do the kind of 0 to 1, build out a team, architecture, all of the systems and processes, because CT had none of that at the time that I joined, but without doing the product market fit stage. Admittedly, that's the hardest part. And then I was an engineer and PM at Google way back when. So wow. Yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Great. So it's interesting you moved from big tech and now you're founder, startup. Tell me a bit about the shift of mentality from going from big tech into startups.
Yeah, I think the biggest shift is how little process and how much more autonomy you want people on your team to work with. You know, we have a brilliant team at Resonant, and I really look for people who are going to work without much guidance, right? And push the company forward as well. And I think over time, you know, the longer I've been doing this, the more I have just kind of lent into the chaos of what that means. So we're very light on process and systems. It's almost like an entirely different job, to be honest. You're much more focused on, is the product working, listening to users, then, you know, is the architecture correct? Have we got the right things for scale? Obviously, you do think about those things, but they're not your primary problem. So.
Right. So are you looking for a different sort of person as well than you would in larger engineering teams in what you're doing today?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the engineers that we've hired would be great engineers almost regardless of where they were. But I think one of the interesting things, you know, I had a conversation with one of the engineers on the team about, you know, performance, et cetera, and the fact that we had no career ladder, and I kind of explained that actually at this stage I don't want everybody to look the same, you know, like people have different talents, and that's incredibly useful, and the most important thing overall is that everybody fits in and pushes the company forward, rather than, you know, they can do a certain number of PRs, or they have expertise in X, Y, and Z. I mean, there are a few kind of core competencies, but really you're looking for a square and a circle and a whole bunch of different shapes of people to produce a team that works really effectively.
Right, okay.
Together.
And I think, so I guess the pace is different. It's why you talk about the sort of the work rate, the types of people, but I imagine the pace is a lot more sort of rapid, I guess, in startups,
Yeah. Actually, it's like a really funny thing from working at a big company. If you write a piece of code, you know, or a feature at a big company, maybe it takes you a week, and realize that like things can start taking just like an hour or even less than that. And then you're like, what do I do now? That kind of like mental, now I need to move on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing is like one of the biggest adjustments, I think, going from a big company to somewhere very small. And it's been accelerated at such a huge pace because of the changes with AI delivery as well. So
right, I think I saw one of your presentations or talks you gave. You spoke about the fact that your last line of code from Google had been deleted or something. Someone had told you this, and it had been there for quite some time, right?
Eight years or nearly a decade or something like that. Yeah. So
I doubt that's going to be the same sort of scenario in a startup. Really, I mean, pace you're moving at is just crazy. So Emma, you came from big tech. What was the big lesson that you learned from the traditional ways of doing things a few years back there to where you are now?
Yeah, I think the biggest shift has been the change to work in an AI native way. I think the beauty of being in a startup right now is that you can really be on the cutting edge of all of the developments that are happening from a AI native development perspective. You know, I think startups are so much more open to experimentation with tooling if you can show, you know, the productivity gains, whereas in a big company, you know, having simultaneously a cursor license, you know, and Anthropic on Macs, etc., becomes a very expensive line item. And so I think the great thing about being in a startup is you really get to push and play and that kind of thing. And so it's really playing into a bit of a divide between traditional engineering in larger companies versus startups that are able to completely embrace this.
Right, okay. So I'd love to unpack that AI native engineer concept, but before we do, what's the sort of the single description you'd have of what it embodies?
Yeah, so it embodies a way of working which is prompt-driven development, you know, combined with still an architectural oversight, I would say, and running it at like a huge scale of parallelization. So you're working on many things simultaneously.
Got it. You talk about shifting from sort of AI assistant work, and we've seen a lot of that with sort of, you know, cursor type approaches, moving towards sort of more AI native. I mean, reflecting from my perspective, having sort of done development a long time ago, is the fact that we came from this sort of like area where it was sort of, assembler and sort of DOS and stuff in way back, and then we moved to sort of third generation languages. So there's a big leap in abstraction there, and then we're moving to AI native, and you've got that next level of abstraction where you're moving away from the code again. But an interesting thing that you've highlighted yourself is that move to, you know, command line interfaces again, moving away from the GUIs that we sort of embrace so much as part of the third generation languages. So we kind of made a bit of a sort of a flip over there, but then we've abstracted ourselves further from how we write code or how you're writing code. Do you want to talk a bit about that sort of that interesting trend? I find it fascinating, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll start with like a few, you know, definitions as per how I think about it. You know, you've got traditional software engineering where you spend, you know, 95% of your time in the code, you know, and maybe 5% of your time running the code, etc. Then I think what we saw in 2025 was this kind of AI assisted, which is kind of tab complete. Maybe you're making changes within the scope of a file, but mostly you're still looking at code 90% of the time. And then the kind of latest trend is the kind of most controversial one, which is the trend towards kind of vibe engineering, where you're prompting at the level of, you're still talking about architecture, you're talking about APIs, etc. But mostly what you're doing is natural language prompting to generate the code. And the most effective way to do that recently has been via Claude Code on the terminal. And therefore, you don't actually spend that much time looking at the code. You look at the code once it's produced, once you know the feature works. And so most of the time that you're spending when, Claude is working, I assume you're doing something else or you're running other Claudes, is actually testing the code, manually, manual verification, etc. And now I think we're actually seeing a further shift, which is to almost not look at the code at all, which becomes even more controversial. And you still see, I'm still amazed to see on LinkedIn and things like that. I saw a comment, there's a podcast I follow, I think it's called Refactor, and the guy that wrote it was basically having a debate with an engineer that was like, you are not an engineer if what you're doing is essentially prompting. And it's amazing to me that we can still be in a world where there is such a dichotomy of opinion in the engineering community as to whether this is, an acceptable form of development, because, we really, really embrace the wave of how to code with AI. We look at the code, of course, we refactor it, and we do take ownership of it, but it's the fastest way to develop by a factor of somewhere between, 3x and 10x, depending on who you are. And so, it is such a huge shift.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal, really.
It really is. I mean, I guess the traits of an AI native engineer are completely different to what we previously thought about engineers, right? In traditionally speaking, where they were sort of experts in how to design code, and that was a skill set. But what you're saying there is that there's actually a different skill set needed now, and the way you even interact with the systems and the tools which you're creating is radically different.
Exactly. The skill becomes about how do you recognize when the kind of prompt-driven development is causing bad smells in your code, etc. And how do you correct for those? How do you use the tooling to self-correct over time so that you get better code without always having to kind of review it and say you made that mistake. So I think that is a real skill. Obviously, reviewing of the code, doing it in a way that you can review a way larger proportion of code now, because the PRs that get produced are so much bigger. And so this kind of like line by line way of reviewing is also not that relevant anymore, but you still want to be able to detect when your system architecturally is not developing in the way that you want, if you see what I mean.
Right, yeah. So I'm just going to pause there, and we're going to go back, because I think we went quite deep immediately. If we could just go back to that question around what is an AI native engineer within the industry? Do you want to describe a bit more around what that role is and how it came about? Yeah,
absolutely. So an AI native engineer, this is kind of my view, my definition, means extremely comfortable using, you can use Cursor to do it, but very comfortable with using agents to produce the majority of the code that they are writing. So that's the first thing, The second thing is comfortable in correcting the kind of mistakes that AI inevitably makes, and being able to really do this at a scale that, traditional engineering doesn't do. You do traditional engineering, you work on a feature, you finish the feature, you move on to the next feature. Whereas if you're going to be a really great AI native engineer, you're probably working on 3 to 10 things simultaneously. So that's just the pure kind of shift from a traditional engineer to an AI native development engineer. Right. But then you also have a set of skills as to how do you make agents effective? How do you think about eval frameworks? How do you think about the tooling that they are provided with? How do you think about the security of agents as well? And so there's kind of 2 different flavors of AI native engineers. Is it just how you do development, or kind of the AI agent developer? I would consider them almost 2 different skill sets.
So you're completely reframing that approach. I guess the challenge there would be the sort of cognitive sort of difference, and even maybe overload with multitasking, running these agent workforce almost for you that's doing the sort of low-level coding, and trying to keep abreast of that and making sure you understand what's going on, and making sure that you're actually structuring your product in a way you want it to, right? There's a lot going on at once, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And engineers who work in this way talk a lot about the kind of mental overhead, of having all of these kind of different sessions and remembering where each of those are in the development life cycle. I have my own way of kind of keeping track of all of the different features that I'm working on. But I think, maybe to talk a little bit about kind of where Resonant fits in this, because I think we work pretty well for product managers, product engineers, etc., is trying to reduce the mental overhead of going from, an idea to implementation, because that does become a big part of the bottleneck. Is like, firstly, you take your feature idea or PRD or whatever, and then you need to turn it into the right language for the agents. You need to keep doing that when you're prompting Claude, etc. So there's a big piece of mental overhead there. And then you need to manage all of these environments, which is also a big overhead. So we allow you to completely parallelize that. So, that's how we can get to 5 or 10 features simultaneously, is by saying, okay, you can prompt it very lightly. It will then turn that into a fully specified prompt for an agent. And then you can send that off and track, how are all these different kind of agents doing, essentially.
So Resonant, we'll talk a bit about Resonant, your product, that very much supports this concept of AI native engineering and taking that sort of initial requirement from a PRD through to completion and build.
Exactly.
Okay.
But doing it on a production code base, which is obviously a different challenge from the challenges which the Lovables or the Replets are trying to solve.
Gosh, yeah, right.
Yeah.
So whenever you've got developers, they can often, historically, would go off and do some work, and you'd always have to sort of bring them back to say, right, what are you actually working on and what's the outcome it's delivering? Why are you doing that? And sometimes that I get lost because people just sort of meander off from the path. So with agents, how do you pull that traceability back into maybe the initial requirement you're building for and the outcome you're looking to deliver? How do you find that traceability between what they're doing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think this is so fascinating because there are a couple of different schools of thoughts. Product managers are being encouraged to prototype. Engineers are being encouraged to almost write the code before the requirements are defined. And so you'll see a camp that really embraces that. It's kind of the Wild West. Things will get produced and there will be a layer of auditability that comes almost after the code is written, right? Whereas there will also be a camp which will move and make this specification layer even more important. And so the PRD still has to be that really important artifact. And so I think of it as almost like, are you PRDing first or are you PRDing after? If you think about how a large organization has to run and develop code, there has to be a layer of auditability, which can be relayed to the business. It can't just be the code. And so I think it'll be very interesting to see if there is a camp of development that kind of produces the PRD after the code's been written as a business artifact, right? But I think you'll see a couple of different kind of schools of thought and ways of working evolving around those two trends, if you see what I mean.
I do, yeah. So I often call it like a shift left, trying to get things running and built up front, and then that iterative process by moving forwards. And it's not getting stuck with that sort of analysis paralysis phase, and you're sort of iterating over the top of that. Is that something you're seeing? I guess my question is, are there different approaches you take? Sometimes you'll go into sort of vibe coding, prototyping, and then build out quickly, and other times you'll maybe spend a bit more time at the PRD phase. How do you see that balance?
Yeah, I mean, for us as a startup, we mostly just want to move super fast, right? And sometimes that means, we had that this week where we'd kind of talked about something at a pretty high level, we'd written a few notes down, and somebody had gone off and implemented it with Resonant, but they'd managed to implement a different feature than the one that I was expecting. It was still useful, and that's kind of acceptable. We're moving fast enough that is that's going to be the case sometimes. But I think for the features where you really want that UX experience to make sense, and they're fundamentally changing how people interact with your product, those are the ones where we spend more time on the PRD and UX stage. So we kind of do a little bit of a mixture of both, to be honest. So yeah, I guess that's how how we think about it.
Are you collapsing roles in a bit there? Because I'm just thinking of the traditional sort of designer, UX designers, business analysts that kind of sit in that upfront space. if you're sort of saying your product managers will actually sort of be able to scope that out, and then the agents go off and iterate quicker, are you able to collapse in some of those roles? Are you seeing that as a trend?
Yes, yeah. I think organizations are just kind of getting to the point in the past. The technology has only really got to the point in the past 6 weeks where you can very feasibly take a PRD and implement it end to end using the kind of systems and technology we have with very little intervention. Obviously, there's a code quality question that needs to be considered, and organizations will have different approaches to that. But I think you'll see organizations more and more embracing the idea that their PMs, UX designers, everybody in the organization will ship code. Everybody at Resonant ships code, from our chief of staff to our growth marketer to our UX designer. Everybody does it. And it wasn't even something that I tried to make happen. It just happened.
Wow.
And it's so interesting because you see all these changes in ways of working. Our growth marketing guy shipped a feature. He was like, I put up a PRD, we'd never discussed it. And it didn't really fit in with the UX paradigms of the system. And that's a kind of difficult balance, because you don't want to kill innovation, but you don't want your product to become like a Christmas tree full of weird feature baubles that somebody's bolted on. And so I think the role of the PM will change to accommodate some of that gatekeeping. But I do think you'll see more and more, commits to production from non-traditionally technical people.
Right. Okay, that's interesting, because there's a big push in the industry at large around sort of forward deployed engineers. We talked a bit about that previously. You've got the sort of the echoes and the deltas. I think it is that one's listening, the other's starting to sort of code and develop quickly. I think one of the key themes of that is that not to strive for perfection, and just to get building, ship something, test it, and then iterate. How do you see that working from that sort of, I guess, CI/CD, continuous integration development perspective we've had previously, and just managing that whole cycle at that pace of not having perfection every time?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really, really difficult. The more code that gets shipped, the more code pathways you have, and the idea of having a totally personalized application for every customer. Honestly, I've seen that play out. Stripe had a ton of kind of gates, as we called them, which were customer specific, or groups of customer specific behavior. I think we were up to kind of thousands by the time that I left, and there was a real effort to try and reduce those just to make the software more maintainable and testable. And I think AI is going to push that to an extreme place, really. I saw a thing on X about a company that had, was fairly successful, and then an AI native version of that company had come along. And the reason the AI native company won was because every time a customer asked for something, they shipped it, right? And obviously it sounds like a cool and great thing until, you're 2 years down the line and you have 3,000 gates and nobody understands really what's happening in production. So it will be a very interesting management challenge as code gets cheaper as to how you maintain exactly that.
That's interesting, because there's a lot of talk about vibe coding, and we talk about vibe engineering, different concept in itself, I would say. But from a vibe coding perspective, people shipping stuff that's not been through those gates, that maybe makes it into enterprises and even business critical scenarios.
Yeah.
How do we kind of protect against that risk? I think because there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm. What are we putting out there? Yeah. I think it's a fascinating question. There's never going to be a one size fits all to that. Every organization needs to answer that question for themselves based on what is the risk appetite of their customers. But I also think enterprises need to wise up a little bit to okay, if you asked for that feature, it's been shipped the next day. Are you comfortable with that? Have you asked the hard questions about how software gets tested and really got underneath that? It's a very difficult thing to get underneath, because a company can give you a bunch of answers. And I think the difference between it's been tested really, really well and it's been kind of tested once, it's kind of difficult
to discern that. But I suspect those questions are not being fully asked at the moment as well.
Yeah, I guess they'll come out in the wash, as they say.
Yeah.
So I think certainly from the perspective of creating maybe POCs using that vibe coding piece, because typically people sort of understand through seeing, right? So POCs have always been pretty powerful, and they are essentially by definition throwaway.
Yeah.
Do you see that sort of going from a requirement that you have documented to a POC? Did you see that as a valid shift and acceleration there, and then maybe use a POC and then look at production later and consider it in a slightly different lens? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think the prototyping and POC wave is a little bit overhyped, is my feeling. If you are trying to create software for a huge construction company, build a POC makes complete sense, big contract values, etc. I think people confuse that scenario where you're trying to communicate to a customer what you're going to build for them and really nail requirements with what a lot of product managers do, which is to try and communicate to an engineering team who are going to ship it pretty quickly. And the prototyping phase has some disadvantages as well that I don't think people talk about enough, which is if I'm going to build a prototype, I'm going to start getting stuck in the details of okay, that button isn't quite right, that interaction isn't quite right. Whereas really what you want to do is get the feature well built into production as fast as possible. And I think prototypes can actually be a distraction from doing that. I think really what people want a lot of the time is the ability to, start writing a feature description, and then as they get to the point where it's much more easy to express it in pictures and kind of prototypes, to do that in very tiny segments, almost within a PRD. We call this kind of PRD prototyping. But it's not you have a full application that people can click around. It is this interaction should work like this with this bit of UI.
Right.
And it should be something you can create in a minute or two, not in half an hour through 10 prompts, if you see what I mean. And I think that is a real unlock, because then you've got a document clearly expressed. The little kind of prototype that you have within it can then be converted into code. You can use that as your spec rather than spending time on code, which is essentially throwaway. I think there's more subtlety to this trend than just PM should be spending all their days prototyping, basically.
Right, interesting. And I guess we've all used sort of things like Figma in the past to mock up and screen wireframes, sketching, even PowerPoints and what have you, to sort of pull together what something should visually look like. Do you see that sort of activity, shall we say, changing as a result of this?
Definitely. I think we didn't have a full-time UX designer when we first created Resonant, and so we shifted things so that we would kind of do more vibe engineering followed by UX to help us on the bits that are difficult. And I think that is a valid way to kind of do very fast iteration and development. I do think the nice thing about Figma is it allows you to take a step back from that implementation and just think about, is this UI really pleasing, and that kind of thing of taste and quality, the bits of UX that you can't always express why something is so much better than another thing, I think can be done sometimes better in Figma than via, trying to vibe code an interface, because you delegate too much of the responsibility to, the agent come up with the UI and then you're tweaking it rather than really being UX first. Right. And I've seen this because we've got a full-time UX designer, and he produces things still in Figma, and I'm like, wow, that looks so much better, I think you'll see lots of different kind of experimentation around this.
So that's that sort of almost human in the loop, but from a sort of product creation perspective, you still need that human sort of sense there, rather than do the sort of just-in-time AI interfaces that just are different every time and haven't really been thought through. So that's interesting that role you think will still continue to be valuable in the process. Yeah,
I do think it will continue to be valuable. I think in general, what we will see when it comes to roles is, as I said, a lot more people shipping to production. The people who are brilliant at their jobs will continue to be highly valued. The people who are shipping according to, a kind of cookbook, and doing very rote development or rote UX design will will not have as much value going forward, if you see what I mean. So there are some very interesting shifts that I think will emerge because of that.
So pick where you focus. I just wanted to touch quickly on the whole concept of user stories, because I think user stories were developed because it was a good way of interacting with normal business users, people that are non-technical. As an X, I will do such and such. It's quite a nice way of framing a requirement to go in a PID, even maybe. Now they're really good for humans. How do agents interpret? How good are they for agents? How are you finding that sort of approach?
Yeah. So. Just for some context, so we started Resonant really to solve a lot of the challenges around managing, agile ceremonies and that kind of thing. And it turns out that as a briefing system for agents, it also works incredibly well. So, and there are a lot of concepts that actually are kind of traditional in agile that convert, or didn't really work in agile, if we're honest, right? That convert over to an AI native way of working even better. And so user stories, I think, traditionally were like a communication mechanism. But for agents, they have the benefit as well that you produce testable slices. So like the big bottleneck in agent-focused kind of development is often, okay, they've produced a bunch of code. Is it working? And if you have your back-end API that was developed by an agent without the front end, then you have to try and manage those two things. Whereas if you've created the absolute smallest slice of testable user behavior, you can really feel a much higher degree of confidence in what the agent has produced. And so I actually think a user story development mechanism, agents do well with it, but also then you get the human in the loop testability piece. And so it's a very powerful construct. I think people shy away from it because everybody looks at that as a user, I want to blah, 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 right? And kind of like, it's like, oh, grim. But actually it works really well. So,
yeah. So let's talk a bit about Resonant. So what sparked the idea for Resonant then? We talked about AI engineering, AI natives. Clearly that was an input to it. But yeah, tell us a bit about where the idea came from.
Yeah, so we were, kind of creating multi-agent systems for different companies. And this company came to us and was essentially like, we're really struggling with, the process of kind of like getting tickets written. It seems to be absorbing a lot of team time. Would you think about making a product along those lines? It was kind of like a good example of really using our underlying framework that we'd built. And so, we started developing this and then realized there was kind of a bigger pain point here. And so was it really inspired by AI native ways of working to start with? Not initially. It was designed around human ways of working, but it turns out that actually it becomes a really good handoff point for agents and for production level deployment of kind of AI native ways of working. So, startups are half strategy and 90% luck. So.
Absolutely. And how long have you been working on Resonant now?
I've been working on it for about 6 months now.
Okay. So.
Yeah. And I would say in the past 6 weeks, it's got to the point where you can take a PRD and pretty reliably ship excellent working code end to end, as a non-technical person on a production code base, which is pretty incredible. Also a bit scary sometimes.
I bet, for sure. There's a lot of developments in this space at the moment, and I think I wonder, how that's affecting the industry. I mean, we've got people that have come from a coding background. I mean, obviously yourself, that's where you come from. I know I've worked in that space, and we've kind of sort of grown up on the traditional understanding how products are structured, how code is sequenced, and how to architect software from the ground up, having done it. I guess if we sort of have this almost leapfrog where we're going, PRDs, understanding the requirements, and then jumping to agents doing the build, what's a career path for a developer look like now with that? I mean, where do they start? Do they have to build that ground up knowledge first so they can actually govern these agents, or are we just saying actually we don't need to do that, the agents are good?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I almost think the developers that are struggling the most are the ones that, came out of university maybe 3-4 years ago. They're now kind of hitting that kind of mid-level point of their career, because what you can see with junior developers who are now growing up with these ways of working is they're very happy letting the agent do a lot of this work, what tends to happen is they produce huge amounts of code for a feature that was super simple
Right.
because they don't have that background of like, no, this should be like 200 lines of code. Why is it 3,000 lines of code? And it's, you know, as a company, how do you want to treat that? We generally have very senior, lean development teams. But I think there is this archetype of the kind of junior developer who is so AI native that they run, you know, 5 different coding agents simultaneously, produce just the most insane amount of code on a daily basis. You know, I'm sure you saw that tweet that suggested someone had produced 10K lines in a day, and everyone was like, that's not real. It is real. You can do that 100% if you really, really parallelize these workflows. Do you want to? Because somebody should probably still be looking at that code, you know, and it tends to be the kind of senior developers who have to do it. So it's a tricky balancing act of then. I think if you've got the very junior developers who are producing a lot of code, how do you then layer on an understanding of like, is the code good? Is that question important anymore? You know, to your point about assembly, nobody looks at the assembled code. Nobody looks at the Java heap dumps anymore, right? Because it's not a necessary skill. And if we're jumping an abstraction layer, you could make an argument that like maybe the junior developers are just embracing the right way of going about it. Maybe it shows my age that I'm not 100% comfortable with that, you know.
So is that whether or not you peek under the bonnet or not, and trusting it and allowing it to go? I think the big thing in any sort of certainly in IT industry is about architectural patterns and practices, right?
Yeah.
And I think what we talked about a bit there was like almost an anti-pattern, recognizing anti-patterns, because often they're hard won, right?
Yeah.
Often the biggest anti-patterns you're looking for is because you've had that experience, you've learned from it in the past, and you want to ensure it doesn't happen again. How can that happen when we're sort of almost jumping that phase? Well, assuming people don't get to see those things pan out because they're not looking under the bonnet.
Yeah. I mean, the way that I think about it on our team is we have periods which are kind of more agent coded and periods that are more kind of human controlled, where we want to address, you know, some of the patterns we're seeing. We want to refactor things. We want to re-architect things. And I think for those moments, it's important that, you know, you kind of rebuild some of the context around the code and also help to correct for any kind of like consistent agentic patterns that are developing, you know. State management on the front end, for example, are there particular kind of things that the agent is doing? How much componentization do you want the agent to do is another example. You know, those are all things that you can kind of control and address, but you do need to kind of take a moment and think about those things. So that's how we do it. And try and address that.
Because there's a lot of concern out there with the large language models and all the chat-based interactions around the slop that's in the models, right? And I know people almost trust a model because it's quite confident in what it said. We've all seen it, or we've actually gone back and said that's wrong, and it's gone, oh yeah, it's wrong.
Yeah.
You're right to challenge me, silly me, and then it will just give you a different answer. And we often struggle with that as humans because we sort of take it for face value almost. And the slop I'm talking about is in comments and text is just sort of Reddit threads that make their way through that are potentially biased or extreme in that. When you look at it from a code level, I think Andre Karpathy said this, you know, if you're doing something that's new, well, then it's not as helpful because there aren't so many posts, you know, of the code out there. There aren't so many examples, and it's running off examples mainly. And whether or not those examples are correct or not is very much a personal perception almost.
Yeah.
How does that play out if we're starting to just sort of like let the agents go and do their thing?
Yeah. I mean, I think your point about just like text, you know, Reddit comments, etc., is interesting because I'm sure both you and I can detect an AI-written post that is obvious. But with a very small change in prompt to the AI generating that post or comment, you can correct for a lot of the patterns that feel very AI sloppy. You know, like all of our LinkedIn posts, I write myself. But then I put them through ChatGPT just to get like a bit of inspiration. But I tell it not to like put its usual rubbish in, right? Because it annoys me reading it. And then I take, little bits of what it's written, little bits of what I've written to kind of create an overall post. It's not really that different when it comes to code. You write your rules and things that are important to you in the MD files, etc. And a bunch of the time, the agent will then follow that. And so I think that pattern can emerge that, like, yes, if you do it badly, it's going to be slop, right? If you do it well, it can be a real source of productivity, creativity, etc. I'm sure some people, would hear that and be like, it's all slop. I would say that 90% of the content that we write is written by human, and then maybe 10% of it is just kind of tweaked by AI, just to kind of bring out a particular point or whatever. But some people would hate that.
Yeah. I think that's key, because there is so many people that just sort of like prompt it and then just copy and paste.
Yeah.
In the terms of LinkedIn posts is a great example where there's so much AI generated content out there. And I think what you're talking about is AI native, which is knowing how to interact with agents rather than just trust them blindly or use them as autocompletes, which they're very good at, because that's essentially what they are. Yeah. I think that concept of working in amongst them is key. And I guess that when you start looking at code, it's that balance in this sort of new breed of engineer, and then being able to achieve that and getting that balance right.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a fun challenge. I think all of the best practices are still emerging as to like what are the ways to do that really effectively. I don't feel like I have seen enough content about how people are enforcing those best practices and what they're really putting in their own code bases to try and help address the AI slop patterns, the equivalent of. I would be very interested to kind of see that.
So what would your advice be to someone? I talk to a lot of early stage career people actually that are sort of just starting out, and it's challenging, as we said. There's much less demand for, I think, 70% reduction in demand for developers at the start of their careers. What would your advice be to their skillings? What should they focus on to skill up getting into the industry at the start?
I think you have to completely throw yourself into the kind of AI native way of working to be part of that wave that is actually going to be better than the people who have come up coding and then embrace the AI native ways of working, essentially. We've worked with some junior people during the time, and some of them definitely embrace it, and that's where some of the lessons learned that we discussed. But we've also seen people who, like, in a week they're still working on kind of 5 lines of code, and I just don't think that there is a great career for people who are going to take that approach, because they're going to get left behind if they're not able to find a way to really essentially jump over where the kind of senior engineers are now, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. So I'm dying to ask you this one, actually. So you actually mentioned before about you've been doing a lot of interviews. Now, without giving too much away, obviously, I'm really interested in how you interview for developers. I understand there's a slightly different approach that you guys take at Resonant.
Yeah, we do. And we're still playing around with it. I'm still not like 100% confident in it. So the way that we approach it is we give someone an engineering task. We give them access to a GitHub repo that's got an engineering task in it. It's a semi-timed test. So it is a time test. They have, a couple of hours, but we're not doing it with them. We ask them to share their screen, and we say, like, use AI how you would use AI to develop this. It's a pretty ambitious task. So you would have to be probably a 10x coder to like get through it without AI, because we want to see, like, how do you work within these systems. We believe they're a huge productivity gain, and so we want to see that balance of both you can use it for a productivity gain, but you also have control over what is being written, and that is what we're looking for really in that interview. Plus, obviously, it has to actually meet the criteria of the end goal. And yeah, I'd say that is pretty high signal, but sometimes it's still difficult to determine between, like, okay, are they that person that's going to write the 3,000 lines of code when it could have been 200, or are they actually, truly brilliant? But we can also tease that out in
goes to
future
show how
interviews as
people
well.
solve problems. There's a great example. About 15 years ago, I was given, I think it would have been one of the advisory firms, and they said that the interview process was they give you a large book with tons of information in it, and then ask you to summarise it and come back with the important salient points within that book. And the ones that didn't succeed were the ones that scanned through the book rapidly, trying to summarise it. And if you turned it over, there was like a summary in the side of the back page, and it was looking for people that would sort of look at the problem and look at it from a different angle maybe, and they were the ones that are going to succeed because they just went with summarised for me. So
that's funny.
It's a trick, I guess, but it's a trick to work out people that don't panic and immediately dive into the detail and kind of look at the problem holistically, I guess, which coming back to your approach, if you start writing code and it's not about output, it's how you solve for the problem, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's the sort of people that you're looking for. And I guess the people that succeed in this world now, as we move away from the heavy toil more into actually from a code perspective to actually sort of architecting it from an agent boss, I think is the term they use. What we're seeing a lot of is even outside of developing code, just in customers of your product, customers of the product we actually launch and build. There's often the sort of the concept that agents will replace standard processes within businesses. So that could be in a contact center, somebody that previously managed incoming calls around product support for a product now moves to inside sales because agents are doing that work for them at a process level. I think beyond just development and coders, there's a huge change for industry as a whole through agents just being put out there, whether they're process agents that are solving business processes or agents that are writing code. I just wonder if you've got any thoughts around sort of the transformation that might have in our industry, in IT in general.
I think the IT industry is kind of a very interesting kind of case study in just how far this can go, because of how significant that transformation is in terms of jobs, the role that you're doing, etc. And I think it is a precursor for what will happen across all industries, really. I guess and I think the important parameter is like how close to a software-based job, a computer-based job is it? The role of a doctor, I think, will change because things like triaging of patients, for example, is I think could be done very effectively with AI, probably with better patient outcomes than currently through the kind of switchboard you experience that you get. But at the end of the day, at a certain point, there will be a stage where you want to be able to look in someone's ears, right? And it's not going to be done by a robot, I think, for a fairly long time. And so I think we'll see the jobs that have a physical interaction will be the least affected, and the desk jobs will be the ones that are hugely affected. So from an economic point of view, given how many people are currently doing desk jobs, it really is going to be such a huge revolutionary change, I think, to where value is going to accrue.
Because it's interesting, because those types of processes that sort of underpin companies and organisations, from supply chain to the doctor example you gave around triaging, those are typically been supported by really monolithic sort of software solutions that have taken years to build. And even in some cases years to specify, right, and spec up before we even get into the build, and then they run over massively, and the whole waterfall legacy of how we built software historically. I think what we're talking about here is if you take the approach that Resonant are using, suddenly you're able to get to product quicker, and it's been able to apply it to those large monolithic systems and being confident that if your finance system is being run on a system that's maybe been built in the way that Resonant builds things, that it's okay, actually. We'll know you won't lose transactions, you won't lose money, it won't impact posting of accounts or monthly close. And I think the confidence that comes from that will pay out over time. The sorts of products that I guess you could use Resonant to build, moving away from sort of task-based products to more enterprise scale. Have you got any thoughts around that?
I think it's a very interesting problem. So for Resonant, because we build a system that builds systems, essentially, it's important that the systems that are built have their own decisions in terms of, what's important from testing, evaluation, etc. And we will follow the requirements that are set essentially for that system. But in terms of the big enterprise systems and how they should think about agents, I think things like evals, for example, are incredibly important to get to the point of having complete confidence in what the agents are doing. Our experience, we built a pretty significant eval system for the SDK, and we don't have an eval system for Resonant, because the rate at which things are changing and the general nature of the problem that we need to be able to solve means we would spend a bunch of time trying to improve, a single hill climbing metric on an eval that really isn't representative of the quality of the system. So it really depends how general purpose the agent deployment is, the risk of the overall task that the agent is trying to do. Take the triage example, the doctor triage example. There is no way you would deploy that to production without an evaluation system. And it would be extremely, finely tuned for that particular task. And it would be a narrow spectrum agent with a very kind of narrow set of tools and capabilities and that kind of thing. And that's where evals work really well. If you're creating an agent to do a whole variety of tasks, kind of like more of a executive assistant agent, for example, then maybe you want evals for particular tasks that it has to do well, but there will be a proportion of tasks that really the eval system that you would have to build would be so much more significantly complicated than the actual agent, and keeping it up to date would be such an onerous task that it's a very careful balance as to when evals make sense. 2024 was the year where I think VCs would ask the question of, do you have evals? And if you said no, they would assume that meant you didn't know what you're doing. Whereas now I think evals is a much more nuanced question, is my overall impression. I think a lot of the big model companies who are working on code generation don't have a lot of evals.
No, that's interesting. I think evals are starting to mature maybe as a space, because I think before it's very much sort of rigid evaluation criteria for, does the output look the same as it should have done from the inputs. Yeah. Whereas now we're getting more those subjective sort of rubric style evals, which were, is this a good response? Is that outcome what I expected to have? Did I get triaged to the right doctor? Yeah. And I think maybe the evals space needs to be evolved. We've had that sort of divergent thinking where everyone's creating lots of content. Yeah. Now when it actually starts to get deployed and used, I guess back to our analogy of not needing to look at the code, but the evals bit becomes more important. So I don't know whether that's another role that's going to sort of flourish. We talked earlier about certain roles naturally become less relevant and other roles maybe flourish a bit more. I don't know your thoughts around the roles, specifically eval roles maybe. Yeah,
I think the role of kind of just general human in the loop evaluation of agent systems is going to be a big shift. That the example of the kind of customer support person where a lot of the role is being done by agents, and maybe they transition to sales, but actually I think the best 10% of those people probably also transition to looking at the results and working out trends of the agents and where they're performing badly. Again, you could try and eval that, but it's really quite hard, because evals are fundamentally a metric-based system. So let's take the example of LinkedIn content and pretend that you wanted to create an eval system for something that produced LinkedIn content. You would give it some metrics like, okay, does it have too many short sentences and em dashes? And that's a metric, but then over time, people's perception of content and what is AI slop will emerge, your evals will have to update, and everything is just, it's kind of Godhart's law, and you'll create a system that stops doing em dashes, but it will have some other very obvious tell from an AI perspective over time if you over-tune to those evals.
Right. So you were just talking about AGI to me, and really interested to get your thoughts on that and where the models are going, where these frontier models are at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So end of November, Anthropic released a new model, and I think over Christmas, we've seen a really, really big shift to being able to do just a lot more complicated software engineering tasks on top of, Opus 4.5. And I think the capability now that Claude has, not just for, producing code, but being able to essentially use a computer like a human. The definition of AGI, it's a fuzzy definition, but I think OpenAI's definition is that a large amount of kind of traditional jobs it will be plausible for a computer to do them. And I think now with the right kind of prompting and systems around it, we're actually pretty close to that point. And I don't think enough people, I think a lot of software engineers who play around with this stuff have realized it. But I think, to that conversation that we were having about triage, etc., I think you can do a lot of that now with kind of small tweaks and systems around just the pure model. So I'm hesitant to say, we're at that point of AGI, but I think we're closer than people think. Everybody that likes to say that Sam Altman was wrong for saying 2025 was the year of AGI or whatever, I don't know. Maybe he wasn't.
Do you think it's in certain contexts it can be, and others it can't? I think when people look at AGI, they think about making life decisions and handing the big ticket macro items off to agents to make a decision for career choices, whether I should do this, do that in life, versus our world in which we live with software engineering, which is actually quite fenced, right?
Yeah.
And within that fenced world, to what you're saying, it's probably there now.
Yeah. I don't even think it's a fencing question. I think a worrying number of people do hand off life decisions to ChatGPT. But also, take the job of, say, a radiologist. I think the key thing there now is having the right MCP tools that the agent can access the same data as the radiologist. And so those aren't very big bridges to build. And if the bridges are built, then I think you can start to get to the point, of achieving that definition, really. So I guess that's how I would think about it.
So you touched on MCP, or Model Context Protocol, to give it its full name. Are you doing work in that space? Do you see that as a sort of a flourishing area now? We have the models and the agents that can then be opened up with all these MCP tools. What's your view?
Yeah, I was talking to someone yesterday actually who worked very deeply with MCP, and they were saying that essentially, they didn't feel like, as of last summer, that MCP was really where people thought it was in terms of this huge unlock. I think that's changed, actually, in the past kind of 3 months, past 3 weeks. You're seeing more remote MCP servers coming online. Things like Figma, for example, have an MCP server now, which is pretty powerful. And the kind of unlock and understanding of how to use remote MCP servers, I think, is also becoming a kind of more commonplace capability. So I think it's both a huge unlock and almost a very thin layer that will do a lot more over time. But the other side of it is these agents are also very capable, just given basic file reading tools. Come back to that radiologist example, and do you need an MCP server, or do you just need someone to put the scans in a file that Claude can look at, right?
Where the data is. It's
kind of two parallel streams that are going on. You've got the basic tools that accomplish a huge amount of things, and MCP servers coming online as well.
Yeah, and I think with that, people are focusing a lot on, I can create an MCP server, I can expose legacy through it. Maybe there's still value in what I did, 5 years ago, but repurpose as an MCP server. I see a lot of developers getting enthusiastic about the number of MCP servers they can produce now. That seems to be the new area. There was also the sort of the concept of the big frontier models, which you just talked about. But there's also the sort of the small language models, or the domain specific. So for that radiologist example, a small domain model may suffice. It doesn't need to know everything.
Yes.
It's tuned really quite acutely for that particular scenario.
Yeah.
I wonder, even in the world of software development, whether that's a direction things might be going in with more domain specificity. Yeah,
and I think coming back to the AGI example, right? The fact that you would need a small language, maybe even not like a language model might not even be the appropriate way to do it. It would be a multimodal model of some form to do the radiologist's job.
Yeah.
And so the fact that you would need that model might suggest we're not at the point of AGI. However, I think with the right tools, you could get a general purpose model to do that training, to request the things that they needed, and then, kind of self-create the model, which is pretty scary.
Yeah, it is. I think there's this focus on fine-tuning as well. We're seeing to make those frontiers actually behave in a way that we would want them to. Is again, is another area that seems to be expanding.
Yeah.
But just talking about, we just talked about it in the break, was that sort of three body ecosystem, which is an interesting concept of now we are. There's three of us at this party. There's the machine, the computer, the human, and then the agent. And how that culturally changes a company. I mean, clearly you're at the front of it with Resonant. You're working in that way. How has that shifted the company culture?
Yeah, I think it's all about software. For so long has been this like skill that was held on a real kind of pedestal, and now I think the code is becoming commoditized, and so questions around business, market, etc. have always been incredibly important in a startup, but I think are now way more important than they were. It used to be the case that even in a startup, I think if you had a wonderfully good engineer from a code perspective who maybe just like didn't really get the user, that would be something that you would still recognize as a really strong strength. And I think over time that's becoming less and less. And from a culture perspective, in a startup, I really do look for people who are going to ask the hard questions of the company. Why are we doing that? Does this make sense? And then not just the why are we doing this, but like, I think there's a better way we can do this, So yeah, definitely try and kind of encourage that from a cultural
So it's that work smart thing, because is it the concept you used? Is it 996, wasn't it? You talked about, and that sort of historic sort of just work all hours. We got people like Elon Musk talking about sleeping on the factory floor and stuff, and that puts that culture out there, which is really it's very sort of burnout, predictable burnout, really. And we were talking a bit about that's not actually a sustainable or a good culture, right? To promote, really, right?
Yeah, I don't feel like 996 is necessarily a bad culture. I think there's a group of people who really thrive in it, and you have to absolutely love what you're doing, and you're going to exclude a bunch of people with families, for example, where that's just not really realistic if you want to be a serious contributing part of that family. Not everybody does. But it's definitely like a valid way of building a business. I think what is hard to do when everybody's just like head down 996 is not become that feature bauble Christmas tree, where like everybody's building all the time. Like, do you have enough time to really get things well designed, etc.? And actually, I saw a post from a founder whose team had really encouraged him. I know that they work 996 to kind of take a bit more of a break, and he was reflecting on how actually it gave him a bit more time and space and that kind of thing. I'm a bad runner. I do running badly, right? But like the thing that I get from running is the headspace to really think about things without a particular question that I'm trying to answer. And a lot of my best and worst thinking happens, when I'm running. And so I think people can just get too consumed by just ship. It has to be a bit more balanced, in my opinion.
Right. I read something yesterday. It was Jeff Bezos actually, and talking about this sort of this muddling hour that he has every day, where it's just zero digital, where he just thinks.
Yeah.
Right, and gets lost in his own thoughts. And it's similar to your running analogy. I mean, I run a bit myself as well. It is fantastic to just switch off and just think things through. And I think we miss that, I think. And, certainly when you've got some big problems to solve, it can often help break those apart. And it's that constant, interaction with machines. So we discussed in the break, we've both got young families, right? So kids of a similar age. I just wonder from where all the AI. I often think to myself, AI is moving so quickly. What sort of world are we going to be creating for those generations coming up through it? How are they interacting with AI now? I mean, my son knows he can talk to ChatGPT and Gemini and have a conversation with them, and just refers to it as that lady in the phone, and he knows it's AI.
Yeah.
To them growing up using it through schooling, and then their careers will just be infused with it. We talk about the three bodies. Have you got any thoughts around what we're laying down the foundations for now, and how that will impact our children when they grow up?
Yeah, it's such a big question. I think if you think about mobile phones and where we have come from, and I think are going with mobile phones and screen time in kids, we're probably 15 years or so on from when smartphones became significant and kids started using them. And I think it's taken a long time for us to get to the point where, Australia has obviously banned social media for kids under 16, and you're seeing a trend of schools really, really resisting having smartphones in schools to protect kids. And I could not be more on board with it. I'm just like, thank goodness my kids are growing up now and not 5 years ago, where all of these questions were at the fore. But I think from an AI perspective, we're our age of kids. We have the same age kids. Our kids are mine are 2 and 5, and yours is 5 as well. We're going to have to contend with that, right? Yeah. At a point when society has not regulated itself yet, and I don't know. I really don't know, and I do find it, quite scary as a question to really understand how do you work with your kids so that what is the value of rote learning anymore? Does it have any meaning? What is the value of problem solving? How do you teach someone to problem solve constructively with AI without pushing too much of their intellect and becoming a bit of vegetable that just types prompts into ChatGPT? It's going to be very difficult, I think. Yeah. What do you think?
I think, given I work in the space, I feel strongly that I have an obligation somehow.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I'm a small cog in a big world, but I do, take it seriously that I have an obligation to provide him the guidance and somehow shape it.
Yeah.
Shape his interaction with it. I don't think I can influence the world as such, working it, so I have a unique insight. So I guess, to use the AI term, guardrails. What guardrails do I have around how my son interacts with the technology? How he can use it, to your point, to a benefit without becoming as you said, vegetable, just typing in getting the answer back out. So I mean, I often look back at the research thing, the concept of going to a library.
Yeah.
And looking information up, and then maybe bringing that back, and then having a conversation with AI to kind of problem solve it together. So we come back to that sort of AI native concept, and I want to try and instill that into him rather than just go straight for the answer, because you don't get that thought challenge process, which I think is so critical in developments of minds, right? You need to develop a mind that can do that.
Yeah.
It's an interesting concept. Right, my other favourite question, which is much easier, is what do you think makes a great AI agent? We ask everybody this question, so I just want to get your view on that.
It's the biggest thing is context. It needs to have the right context for the task that it's doing. So creating a great agent is mostly about context management as an engineering challenge. And then the second order thing I would say is, if you're creating what I think of as a narrow purpose agent, you need evals and a great eval system that can really evolve with the models as well, and that you're really staying on top of. And if you're building more of a general purpose agent, thinking through what tools does it have, what is the kind of tool ecosystem that it needs to do its job really well, and trying to not make it too special purpose, a lot of the time agents do their best work, I think, if they're general purpose, if you can build on top of the concepts of file systems and code, because that is really what agents are best at. So, yeah, that's...
Like it. So, what next for Resonant. Where are you going, and where will you be in 6 months, 12 months from now? What are your plans, if you're able to share those?
Yeah, absolutely. So the place where Resonant is at now is you can edit your website using the Chrome extension, turn that straight into tickets and implement them. It probably takes about 10 minutes. You can do all of the minor UX tweaks. You can take a PRD and ship it all the way through. Where I think we will go next is this PRD prototyping concept, and then also to try and create systems that are self-reinforcing. So basically to allow it to test and understand, okay, I've got a PRD, that means I need these browser tests, and I'm going to articulate those, then I'm going to run them, and then I'm going to put all of it together to basically produce a system that can really, really get that PRD shipped even better than it does today, which is pretty good.
Wow, exciting.
Yeah.
I think you're clearly way ahead of the curve, both from what you're doing, where the industry needs to go from this AI native concept, to also just a cultural perspective as well, the sort of teams that you're creating and the learnings you're getting. So I really want to thank you for sharing that with us today. It's been fantastic to talk to you, and I really wish you and Resonant, your team, all the success for the future, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for the time.